Okay, hi there. We're going to try this again. This is my second attempt to cram this into 5 minutes, okay? 1 Timothy chapter 2, 11 and 12. Paul says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." Wow, that just seems like we're done, right? Close the book, we're finished. But we're not. Because here's what's going on, and this happens quite often. Again, this is not a dodge. This is not an attempt to twist the scriptures to get them to say what I want to say. This is honest biblical scholarship. Okay, we need to understand difficult passages like this, that there are three things in play. One of them is a cultural context that we are not aware of, that once we understand it, it makes the scripture make more sense. It sheds more light on the passage. Okay, and we know this not just from history, not just from the history books, not just from other scholars. We know it from the book of Acts. The book of Acts talks about Ephesus, which is where this letter was written to Timothy in Ephesus, as he was left behind to instruct, quote, certain people who were teaching something that was wrong. So the whole purpose of 1 Timothy is for Paul to leave Timothy behind and to write Timothy instructions to correct some false teaching that's going on there. So there's a cultural context we need to understand, which was the worship of Artemis. The Artemis temple was in Ephesus. It's mentioned in the book of Acts. There was a huge outcry in the city against Paul by the worshipers of Artemis. Artemis was a female cult with women priests, where women were in charge. The teachings of Artemis were that women were made first and then came men. Paul corrects that in Timothy. He does that for that very reason. He's correcting that false teaching. So that's what he's getting at here. And so when Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:11, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission, he has a specific woman in mind. He does not say all women should learn in quietness. It's not an instruction to all women everywhere. In fact, this letter isn't even for the entire church. This is a letter for Timothy dealing with specific problems. He even says it at the beginning of the letter, certain people that he wants Timothy to correct. And being in Ephesus, and the fact that this is the whole letter is dealing with, or is in large part dealing with, how women, how a woman is teaching something false. That's the whole context and purpose of it. So I said there were three things. Another thing that's one is the cultural context. Two is there's a bias in our translations. And three, there's just flat out bad translations. There are years of bias against women that have been going on for centuries, and so there's not just the scriptures themselves, but an overarching, an umbrella sort of teaching and assumption that has been carried forward in the culture of the church for a long, long time. Based on things, misunderstandings and false teachings that we need to correct. Okay, and then the third one is really just bad translations. So, for example, in verse 12, who knows how it reads, but if you go to the Greek, it reads more like this: "I do not permit a woman to teach in order to gain authority over a man." Okay, in other words, Paul there is tying the idea of a woman who he will not permit to teach, that he's not permitting that woman to teach so that she can have authority over men. The wrong assumption we have had for the longest time is that if you teach, you have authority over someone. You know, the New Testament never teaches that. Nowhere. And you know, if you go to other places in the scriptures, there's plenty of places where women teach men, and that's okay. Paul's okay with that. It happens even in the Old Testament. People are okay with that. When Paul talks about prophesying, which we'll come to in a later video in 1 Corinthians, he's totally okay. In fact, he intends that the act of prophesying is something that is done by both genders. He gives specific instructions for the right and the wrong way for men and women to prophesy. But by the way, later on in that same passage, which we'll get to that later, but Paul talks about how prophesying in the church leads to edification and growth and teaching. People are going to learn something if you prophesy, and men and women are called to do that. So 1 Timothy chapter 2:11, you need to understand the Artemis cult. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was in Ephesus. This is the church that was dealing and struggling with this idea of women taking authority over men in the church, the way they did in the Artemis cult. And why, by the way, this makes sense of the verse 15, where he says, but women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and propriety. I know I'm over a little bit, but I'm going to finish this thought since I started it. If you understand the Artemis cult and you understand that the way that women worshipped Artemis was to braid their hair, and that the reason they would do that was so that Artemis would protect their life as they gave birth to their baby, and would protect the life of their baby as they gave birth. So if you understand that that's one of the key teachings of the Artemis cult, then you understand why Paul urges women to dress modestly, not to braid and adorn their hair. He's not against braiding and adorning hair. He's against women in Ephesus doing something that is seen as worshiping Artemis. And why would you do that? Why do women do that? Why would they braid their hair and do those things? So that Artemis would protect their child and them and their life as they gave birth. This is why Paul gives the instruction, but women will be saved through childbearing, meaning God will protect you, Jesus will protect you. That's why he says women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, in love, and in holiness and propriety. Meaning you don't need to go to Artemis for that. God will take care of you. Put your hope and your faith in Jesus. So I hope that's helpful. Any questions, please leave them there. We're going to keep going with this. And if we can, we're going to tackle 1 Corinthians next. But this is going to be an ongoing series, and I am very excited about it. Thanks for listening. God bless.